This is Culloden, April 16, 1746, the last pitched battle fought on British soil, and the final desperate stand of the Jacobite cause. For decades, Britain has been a house divided. In 1688, the Catholic King James II was deposed in the Glorious Revolution and replaced by his Protestant daughter Mary and her husband William of Orange. Yet the Jacobites, supporters of James and his heirs, never accepted the loss. From Ireland to the Highlands, rebellion simmered. They rose in 1689, again in 1715, and again in 1719, each time crushed but not forgotten. By 1745, a new figure appeared, Charles Edward Stuart, grandson of James II. To his supporters he was the rightful heir, the Prince of Wales in exile. To London he was the pretender. With French encouragement, Charles landed in the Scottish Highlands in July 1745. In a dazzling march, his mostly Highland army captured Edinburgh and routed British forces at Prestonpans. They swept south into England, reaching as far as Derby, only 125 miles from London. For a moment it seemed the Stuart crown might truly be restored. But hesitation, poor coordination with promised French reinforcements, and wavering support from English Jacobites stalled the advance. The Prince's Council voted to retreat back to Scotland. Pursued by a reorganized government army under the Duke of Cumberland, son of King George II, the Jacobites fell back northward. Winter, hunger, and desertion gnawed at them. By spring 1746, Charles gathered his exhausted forces near Inverness, determined to make a stand. This was no minor skirmish. The fate of the Stuart dynasty, the autonomy of the Highlands, and the future of Britain's monarchy were about to be decided on a rain-soaked field called Culloden Moor. Charles commanded around 5,000 to 7,000 men by April, though numbers vary. Most were Highland clansmen, MacDonalds, Camerons, Frasers, Macintoshes, men bound by kinship and tradition, many wielding broadswords, targes, small round shields, and dirks. They had few cavalry and limited artillery. Their strength lay in the famous Highland charge, a ferocious rush meant to smash enemy lines before disciplined musket volleys could stop them. Yet the army was fraying. Supplies were scarce, pay often non-existent. Some Lowland and French regulars bolstered their ranks, but morale sagged. Charles, once a romantic figure, now seemed indecisive. His officers quarreled over strategy. Hunger haunted the camp. Even the fierce Highlanders were weary. Facing them was a well-supplied force of about 8,000 under William Augustus, Duke of Cumberland. Fresh from winter training at Aberdeen, his troops were drilled to counter the Highland charge. They were mostly British regulars, English, Scots, and Irish Protestants, arrayed in disciplined battalions with ample cannon and cavalry. Red coats, gleaming bayonets, and a steady drumbeat contrasted sharply with the Jacobites' ragged tartans. Cumberland had studied past Jacobite uprisings and adapted tactics. Artillery would open the fight. Infantry would deliver controlled volleys, then step forward with fixed bayonets aimed not at the man directly in front but at his exposed right side, a deadly innovation against the Highlanders' targe. Cavalry waited on the flanks to exploit any break. Culloden Moor lay just east of Inverness. It was a flat, boggy expanse dotted with heather and scrub, hemmed by stone walls and ditches. For the Highlanders, who preferred broken ground for swift charges, it was poor terrain. Rain and sleet turned the field into sucking mud. Visibility was low. Yet Charles, against the advice of some commanders, chose this ground, partly because it blocked Cumberland's path to Inverness and partly out of desperation. At dawn on April 16, 1746, both armies prepared. The Jacobites were cold, hungry, many still exhausted from a failed night march intended to surprise Cumberland's camp. They formed up nonetheless, clan by clan, broadswords in hand, bagpipes keening. Across the moor the government army stood in 3 long lines, cannon already in place, flags stiff in the wind. Tension hung thick. This was not just another clash. For the Jacobites it was a final gamble. Victory might open the road to renewed invasion of England. Defeat could mean the end of their cause forever. All through the night of April 15th, the Jacobite camp at Culloden stirred with whispered orders. Charles had approved a bold plan, a surprise night march to fall on Cumberland's camp before dawn. Hungry, soaked, and bone-tired, thousands of Highlanders stumbled through the darkness along narrow tracks. Muskets knocked against stones. Shoes sucked off in the bog. Some men fell behind. Units became separated. As the black sky lightened toward gray, it was clear they would not reach their target in time. Exhausted and disordered, the army had to turn back. By dawn they were trudging once more onto Culloden Moor, hungry, shivering, and without rest, just as the government forces approached. Inside the Jacobite command, tempers flared. Lord George Murray urged retreat to more favorable ground. The MacDonald clans complained bitterly at being placed on the left wing instead of the right, an old tradition of honor among Highlanders. Charles, pale and stubborn, insisted on making his stand here. Some whispered that the prince's French advisors swayed him. Whatever the reason, the Jacobite army began to form up in lines across the sodden moor. On the opposite side, Cumberland's men were fresh, fed, and eager. Their artillery had been carefully positioned. Their ranks were drawn up in neat formations, drums steady, colors bright against the gloom. They could hear the distant skirl of Jacobite pipes. To some it sounded wild and frightening, to others like the cry of doomed men. Shortly after 11 a.m. the battle began. Cumberland's artillery thundered first, hurling round shot and grape shot into the Jacobite lines. The soft ground made it hard for the Jacobites' few cannon to answer effectively. Many of their gunners had already been killed or scattered. For nearly half an hour government guns tore bloody gaps in the motionless Highland ranks. The prince, on horseback behind the line, urged his men to hold steady until ordered to charge. Rain and sleet lashed across the field. Smoke thickened. Highlanders shifted restlessly, clutching their targes, waiting for the signal. Some clans began to edge forward without orders. Men dropped in rows under the relentless iron storm. Finally, unable to bear it any longer, the right wing, the Camerons, Stuarts, and Athole men, surged ahead with a roar. Bagpipes screamed, broadswords flashed, and thousands of Highlanders burst across the moor. Mud sucked at their legs, slowing them. Artillery and musket fire raked their ranks. Still they closed the distance, shouting clan cries, Lochiel, Claymore. As they hurled themselves at the red lines, the government infantry stood firm. Trained to fire in platoons, they delivered withering volleys at close range. Bayonets thrust not at the man directly before them but at the unshielded side of the Highlander next to him, exactly as Cumberland had drilled them. It was devastating. Whole sections of the charge broke apart before even reaching the bayonets. Yet pockets of Highlanders crashed into the first line, hacking with broadswords and dirks. Brief, savage hand-to-hand fighting erupted. For a moment the government center wavered under the sheer ferocity of the assault. Cumberland threw in fresh battalions and directed flanking fire into the compressed Highland mass. His cavalry swept around the Jacobite left, cutting down fugitives and threatening to encircle the whole army. The MacDonald wing, still angry at their placement and hammered by artillery, advanced late and hesitantly, leaving a gap. Government troops exploited it, pouring musket fire into the exposed flank. Within minutes the right-wing assault was repulsed. Men fell back in disorder, others ran. The government's second line moved up, bayonets gleaming, drums beating. The Highland charge, once a thing of terror, had been blunted and broken. Seeing the right wing shattered and the left disintegrating under cavalry attacks, the Jacobite center began to crumble. The prince tried to rally his guards, but panic swept the field. Highlanders threw down muskets and fled toward the walls and ditches at the rear. Government dragoons cut them down as they ran. Artillery continued to fire into the retreating mass. Charles was urged to leave before capture. Reluctantly, he turned his horse and rode off the field, the dream of a Stuart restoration dying behind him. By early afternoon, the moor was strewn with the dead and dying. The Jacobite army had ceased to exist as a fighting force. When the guns fell silent, Culloden Moor was a slaughterhouse. More than 1,000 Jacobites lay dead or dying in the mud. Entire clans were shattered. By contrast, Cumberland's army lost fewer than 400 men. The moor was still and gray, littered with tartan bodies, smashed broadswords, and broken drums. Smoke drifted in the sleet. The last pitched battle fought on British soil had lasted barely an hour, and it had ended the Jacobite dream. But the killing did not stop with the battle. Cumberland unleashed a ruthless pursuit. Government troops combed the Highlands, burning crofts, seizing cattle, and executing suspected rebels. Wounded Highlanders left on the field were bayoneted or shot. Captured Jacobites were hanged or transported to penal colonies. The Duke earned the nickname Butcher Cumberland, a name that would stick in Scottish memory for generations. Charles Edward Stuart escaped the battlefield with a handful of companions. 4 months he evaded capture, moving from glen to glen, sometimes disguised as a servant, sometimes hidden by loyal Highlanders at great risk. His most famous flight was with Flora MacDonald, who smuggled him over the sea to Skye dressed as Betty Burke. Eventually he reached France in exile, his cause lost, his legend beginning. For the Highlands, Culloden was a turning point. In the aftermath, the British government moved to dismantle the clan system that had sustained Jacobite uprisings. The Disarming Act forbade Highlanders to carry weapons. Wearing tartan or the kilt was outlawed. Chiefs lost legal authority over their clans. Forts and roads were built to tighten government control. In less than a generation, the traditional Highland way of life had been irreparably changed. Politically, Culloden secured the Hanoverian dynasty on the British throne. It ended any realistic chance of a Stuart restoration and allowed Britain to turn outward, to empire, trade, and war with France, without fearing rebellion at home. In that sense, a muddy moor outside Inverness helped shape the modern British state. Yet Culloden also created a powerful myth. For many Scots it became a symbol of lost independence and heroic resistance. Songs, poems, and later romantic histories would paint the Jacobites in tragic colors. Tourists would walk the field and feel the weight of history. The moor itself would become a place of mourning and memory. Today Culloden Moor is quiet. Heather and grass cover the scars of battle. Low stone markers show where clans fell. Here lie the MacDonalds, here lie the Camerons. The wind carries the cries of curlews instead of war pipes. Yet if you stand there on an April morning, you can almost hear the echo of broadswords clashing and muskets firing, the last desperate charge of men fighting for a lost cause. The Battle of Culloden was short, brutal, and decisive. It ended an era and began another. It's a reminder of how dreams of power and restoration can end in mud and blood, and how their stories can live on long after. If you found this story gripping, there are many more forgotten battles and turning points in history waiting to be told. Subscribe to this channel to journey deeper into the wars, rebellions, and last stands that shaped our world. And don't miss our next episode, where we uncover another clash that changed history forever.